So without further ado, tonight's speaker is John Marvin. John is a habitat coordinator. He's a fisheries habitat biologist and habitat coordinator with the Yakama Nation. And we're honored to have a biologist speak with us tonight with knowledge of both Western and traditional ways of interpreting ecology, and then also knowledge of both water ecology and forest ecology, shrub steppe ecology. John brings that together in his position. He has also played drums since the age of 12. So we are in the hands of a very talented, multi-talented individual. So without further ado, take it away, John Marvin.
All right, can everyone see the screen? All right, cool. All right, well, thank you so much for having me tonight. Yeah, it's quite an honor. It's actually kind of my first big talk, kind of describing all the things that we kind of do as the habitat program with the Yakama Nation, Yakima Fisheries Project. I was born and raised in Yakima. I graduated from Eisenhower in 90. I'm a YVC alum in 92. Central in 99. I took some time off to live a little in my 20s. And then I got a river restoration certification from Portland State University in 2018. So I'm going to try and squeeze 40 million years into under an hour. So wish me luck. So with that being said, geologic time, right? So I got some of the arrows here. You know, this is all of geologic time here on the left, kind of squeezing it down here into the Quaternary. And then we are basically in the Holocene time right now. So some of the things that we're still living with and dealing with our surroundings are still tied with some of these time frames, and this kind of put in perspective of some of the things I want to talk about here. So I think it's pretty important to understand what you're surrounded by, right? What your feet are on. So looking at the geology of the Yakima River Basin, this is the superficial geology here. It's kind of, you know, there's a lot of the blue, which I'm going to talk about, some of the basalts and the cascades and our valleys and our ridges, and kind of how all these landforms got here to make the Yakima River Basin unique and where we all live, and how it was able to produce the sort of landscapes that produce the variety of fish and wildlife that is some still here and some that aren't, but we'll get to that. So just looking at sort of the topography of the Yakima River Basin, you guys can see my cursor here. So we've got the Cascades, obviously here on the west side, and you know, from the headwaters up in the Cle Elum down to the confluence with the Columbia down to the Tri-Cities. Noticing, you know, looking at the Yakima ridges, the Yakima fold system, and how it creates these valleys and canyons and a diverse array of habitats from the top to the bottom. You know, we're having 100 inches of precipitation in the headwaters and 7 inches down at the mouth. So it's kind of thinking of, you know, especially salmon that are a cold water fish that, you know, could thrive and be prosperous in a basin that's mostly desert, but we'll get to that. So kind of just starting with the Cascade Mountains, you know, they run from California to British Columbia. They're basically just a bunch of volcanoes on top, about 40 million years worth of volcanoes from about 17 million years ago. They were building for about 20 million years prior to that. Lots of volcanics here. I don't know if, you know, talking about the Pacific Ring of Fire. So this sort of landscape of volcanism is typical to the Ring of Fire here, from all the way to South America, all the way over to Asia. And it's basically plate tectonics. So the Earth is covered, this crust is kind of broken up into these plates, and they're all kind of floating on top of this sea of magma. the plates bump into each other, they go underneath each other. So specific to the Pacific Northwest here, Juan de Fuca plate is basically going under the North American plates, and it melts and the lava squirts up to the surface, creating these mountains through volcanism. So we're all familiar with, Mount Rainier and of course Mount St. Helens. If anyone was here in 1980, I remember that pretty vividly. Those are the babies of all these volcanoes that have been, working for 40 million years. A good example, there's tons of older examples like Edgar Rock up on the Natchez, just kind of downstream from Whistling Jacks is the core of an ancient volcano. There's ancient volcano cores scattered throughout. Most people don't notice them, but babies and grandpas, I guess. And then looking at the Columbia Basalt Group. So after the Cascades, the theory is that there was a hot spot in the Earth's magma that kind of moved eastward. So it's one of the youngest and smallest salt flows on Earth. It covers from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, northern Nevada. They occurred between 16 and about 5 million years ago, and they're so it happened over millions of years, and so they kind of break them out by kind of different flows, and some of them are really thick, some of them are like miles thick, some of them are thinner. At millions of years, there's interbeds in between these basalt flows. You can often find fossils, like the petrified wood often is trapped in between these basalt flows. So, but really kind of the big provinces of at least where we're doing with Washington, of the Cascades and the Columbia Basin basalt flows. So they kind of started over eastern Washington, Idaho, and it was very viscous lava. I mean, it flowed all the way to the Pacific Ocean, down the Willamette Valley, all the way down into Nevada, just layers upon layers of this basalt lava. Move this thing out of the way. So then after this, lava was formed, and a few million years still passed by. So we have the ridges. So it's called the Yakima Fold Belt. So basically these flat layers of basalt were basically twisted and bent to form these ridges, the synclines and the anticlines, the valleys and the ridges. This process of the ridges is still actually happening. There are geologists out there measuring the contortion of the basalts. And this kind of leads to what I'm going to get to in a little bit here, is it's these things called beads on a string. So this is really important for the ecology for salmon in the future. These ridges and valleys are super important. So here's kind of a map of the ridges in the Yakima Fold Belt system. And then the Yakima River Canyon, which is a pretty unique geologic feature. It's an entrenched meander. So as the ridges are rising, the river was able to cut through the basalt at the same rate that the ridge was rising. That's how we have a lot of our gaps too, like the Union Gap and Sela Gap. The river cut through the ridges as they were rising. Some places they were more successful than others. There's some of the ridges that the river got pushed around. Originally, the Yakima River and the Columbia River's confluence were out by Moxie. The ridges rose and pushed the river away, and the flood basalts also manipulated the flow of the Columbia River. There's that big turn up north, kind of above Wenatchee. The Columbia River basalts pushed the Columbia River in that direction. And then a little bit in the Ice Age. So there was the Accordion ice sheet, about the max was about 20,000 years ago. The final retreat of the glaciers was only 14 to 10,000 years ago. So we didn't actually have any of the ice sheets in the Yakima Valley, so to say, but there's a relationship to the glaciation of the ice sheets and alpine glaciation. So it was, the Ice Age. So there was a ton of glaciers in the mountains, and then the ice sheet kind of went back and forth. Its furthest extent was basically what created the Puget Sound. So I mean, went as far to create Puget Sound. But one interesting about at least with the ice age at that time, so one of the impacts that we do have, at least you can see in the Yakima Valley, is the Missoula floods. So the ice sheet would come down out of Canada, and it basically was a dam on the Clark Fork River in Missoula, or around Missoula, Montana, called the Glacial Lake Missoula. So this huge lake, I'm like Great Lakes size lake, formed behind the ice sheet, and the dam would break, and this like gigantic flood would come down. The scab lands out in eastern Washington. It was like biblical size floods. And those floods did actually back up into the Yakima Valley, as far as like kind of the Moxie Yakima area. They're most visible kind of down around Zilla, where it's called the Tucci beds, like the Tucci River down in by Walla Walla. But it's those, right along the freeway, those tall white cliffs you see along the freeway. That's all. It's their glacial lake deposits. So there's, glaciers are grinding rocks, and so there's a lot of flour, it's called, in the water. So we can kind of see that. And a lot of the like fossils they find in some of the deposits around the Yakima Valley or in the Northwest are often found in these glacial lake deposits. When they find the mammoth, they found a mammoth out by Moxie. It's kind of an interesting thing. But so part of our geology, but more important was kind of the alpine glaciers in the Cascades, especially in the upper Yakima. When I'll get to the, those glacial lakes that are everyone recognizes when you drive over the pass. But those were pretty important for creating a lot of the fill for the valleys. So we have the ridges and the valleys. So a lot of the valleys were filled with these glacial deposits, nice round rocks. And at least as far as in the upper valley, I think the glaciers went about as far as around the Teanaway. And there was another sort of glacial lake that was formed around the Teanaway. There's some interesting geology up there. So here's just kind of a map kind of describing all that. So we've got the Cascade Range, Columbia River, showing the Missoula floods and the way they came down, if you even filled up the Willamette Valley. Yeah, the floods are really interesting. When I was in school, I did some field work in Douglas County, and they're called erratics. So they're rocks that basically fall into the ice or on top of the ice, but they're rocks like bigger than your house. It's really an interesting landforms that the glaciers and the glaciation formed, and literally it was only like 10,000 years ago, which when you look at the geologic time is doesn't even register. It's hard to register. But we do still have some glaciers left in Washington, at least. They are much smaller and shrinking as we look at global climate change. So an interesting part of what we have left, at least in the Yakima Basin for glaciers, are in the Goat Rocks. They have at least 4 named. Last time I was up there, they are shrinking very quickly. The Goat Rocks is one of those extinct volcanoes. And about 1 million years ago, which is also very short in geologic time, had another large lava flow, but it was andesitic as opposed to basaltic, and flowed basically down to the Natchez and Tieton rivers, encompassing, I think, most, if not all, of Cowiche Canyon is all andesite. It looks very similar to basalt. It's in columns, but chemically it is different. And that the flow is recognized as the longest andesite flow on Earth. And if you want to know more about our local geology and someone who presents it much better than myself, I would recommend you look for Nick Zentner. He's a geology professor at CWU. Nick on the Rocks, his video series on YouTube, or for PBS, I believe. Anyways, I highly recommend you watching them. They're very entertaining. So back to the Yakima River Basin. So Cascades, Columbia River basalts, the twisting, the formation of the the ridges and valleys. So we've got, the eastern, and then, up in Cle Elum valleys, then it goes Kittitas Valley, the canyon, Sela, Yakima, Wapato, and then looking at Ketchies, Ketchilas, and Cle Elum lakes in the upper valley were all alpine glacial lakes that had a natural, so when a glacier recedes, it creates a moraine, and usually the moraine will create a natural glacial lake. Bumping River was another glacial lake, and then Rimrock Reservoir was a lake at some point in time, but had filled in over time and was a meadow, at least for recent geologic past. Like, wait a minute, I thought this was a presentation about salmon. I haven't hardly talked about salmon, so we're gonna get into it. All right, so salmonids, Yakima Basin, salmon, trout, char, freshwater whitefish are all considered salmonids. So in the Yakima Basin, we got, the Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink and chum are the other two, but we don't actually have those in the Yakima River Basin. Trout, rainbow and steelhead, and native cutthroat. Char are bull trout. They're not actually a trout. And then mountain whitefish. So the salmon life cycle, or an anadromous life cycle, is basically born in freshwater, go to the ocean, live most of their lives in the ocean, and then migrate back to freshwater to reproduce. Salmon are not the only fish species that live in an anadromous life cycle. Lamprey, I'll get to. Char, at least, char do also, although Yakima Basin char do not anymore, and also sturgeon. And most of them die after they spawn. So Chinook, everyone's know Chinook, king salmon, kind of the iconic salmon of the Pacific Northwest. The qualifiers for spring, summer, and fall basically designates when they begin their spawn, when they enter fresh water from the ocean. And I'll get to the fact that it takes them a while to actually get to where they need to go. Coho, are also known as silvers, was a very abundant salmon species in the Yakima Basin. Sockeye salmon, another one. An interesting component about sockeye salmon is they have to spawn to a lake. So I pointed out, we had those glacial lakes in the upper basins of the Yakima. So they have to go to a lake. Most spawn in tributaries above the lake, but some do spawn in the margins of a lake, but they have to have a lake. And landlocked kokanee, or kokanee that don't live in an anadromous life cycle, are referred to as kokanee. And then our trout, so rainbow trout and steelhead trout are genetically the same fish. They are the same fish. Rainbow trout is the resident form, and steelhead is the anadromous form. We are not really sure why they do this. At least we can't prove it. There's theories on why. It's mostly just filling a habitat niche. So steelhead can fill basically almost every habitat niche in almost every basin. They are found from Alaska all the way down to Central America. Adult steelhead can be, from 20, 30 pounds to in the John Day Basin, they'll find adult anadromous steelhead that are like 12 inches. So, but they're filling the niche for smaller streams, bigger streams, and they're spread throughout the basin, at least where there's still habitat access. And then of course we have our native cutthroat trout, really cold water, mostly in the upper watershed, at least now where we only have cold water. And then bull trout. So like I said, it's a char. It's not necessarily a trout. My dad still calls them Dolly Varden. I can't get it out of his head that they're a different fish. And every time we go like up to Rimrock and you cross the bridge, you go to the backside of Rimrock, he tells me the story every time. I remember when I caught this Dolly Varden under this bridge. I guess it was a big one because he tells the story every time. And char lived a variety of lifestyles. They can be anadromous. They go from lakes to streams. Some are only live in streams. Also trying to fill, the many habitat niches that are available to them. And then lamprey. So lamprey, like I said, is also an anadromous fish. They live a similar but different life cycle. So they spend part of their time as a little, I always mispronounce it wrong, like I said, I'm a fish biologist, but amosete, and they live in the mud and they're like filter feeders. And then they do that for 3 to 7 years, and then they decide to turn into the adult form of the lamprey that is parasitic, and they go out to the ocean and they live the ocean, and then they do the same as other anadromous fish, and they come back to the freshwater to spawn. All right, so talking about our indigenous people in the Yakima River Basin. So they've been here since the beginning of time. And like Matt was talking about, well, there's 14 bands that made up the Yakama Nation, and they don't necessarily call themselves Yakima, or at least they didn't used to. I'm not going to try and pronounce that word because I'm not sure how to pronounce it, and I don't want to disgrace it. But Yakima is what they got called at the treaty signing, so that's what they've been known as since. So, I mean, hunter-gatherers, they use the entire landscape, migrating from different place to place, depending on where the food was, winters in the lower parts of the valley. Basically, every tributary to the Yakima River had a village. There were many families, and they all kind of knew each other and were related in some aspects, and then traded and came together at certain points. And in the summer, and would travel up to the upper watersheds, following the flora and the fauna as they were hunting and gathering. Especially in the springtime, like I said, moving up the up elevation, following the roots and the berries. Camas was a really important route for the Yakima people. I've heard stories from of an Ellensburg, the Nanum fan that comes basically out of the Nanum right above Ellensburg. It's this huge alluvial fan, probably the worst place to put a city, right at the bottom of alluvial fan, but it is where it is. But apparently thousands of people would come from all over. They had rodeos, and they would have feasts, and there was some alluvial fan, so it had a lot of water, and it had a lot of camas. So Sahaptin is the language that the Yakima people speak. I'm also not going to try and pronounce these again, my apologies, but basically it gets to the fact that they are salmon people. Their lives were so intimate with salmon that they don't see a separation between themselves and a life without salmon. So kind of the story of the creator, when the people came, the creator called out to all the beings on the earth and said, hey, can you help take care of these people for me? And the water said, yeah, I will help take care of them. And this salmon said, yeah, me too. So obviously salmon and water, and when they have a feast and a celebration, the water is first and the salmon is second. So that being said, so maybe second to Nanum Fan was the Celio Falls. It was a natural waterfalls on the Columbia River, and for thousands of years, time immemorial, thousands of people would come to this area from all over, from the coast, from the plains, from the south, the north. It was a time for feasts and games and trading, especially, if you wanted obsidian from Oregon and you didn't have any, that was the place to get it. And you would trade for obsidian or whatever tools or any food that you needed. But unfortunately, in 1957, when the US government built the Dalles Dam, they flooded Celio Falls forever. Or at least for the time being. So with that being said, so the Treaty of 1855, the Yakama Nation and the other tribes that were party to the treaties in 1855 at the fort in Walla Walla with Governor Isaac Stevens. They didn't really have a choice to sign it. I think he threatened them they'd be knee deep in blood if they did not. So they made their marks, or at least the ones that were there did. Not all of the tribes did, but at least there were some thought at least put into these treaties, the Walla Walla Treaty, and then some of the West Side treaties, at least during this time, for taking care of these people into the future. So one of the most important parts of the treaty is that they reserved the right to fish, hunt, and gather all of their traditional foods on their reservation, as well as their ceded area. And so I got the map here of the ceded area. So it's a very large area, and then the reservations there in blue. So they retain those rights, and ceded and then unclaimed as it gets into the future. So Isaac Stevens wasn't necessarily the nicest guy with doing the treaty, and basically 12 days after it was signed, he started letting settlers into the valley. They were supposed to give them 2 years. I mean, it took a few years after the approval had to get approved by Congress. So the Yakimas weren't very happy about that. And there was the Yakama War. The war was fought on both sides of the Cascades, all around the Northwest. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, it's part of history that the war was ended, and the Yakimas went to their reservation. So there's a little treaty law. You could, I mean, there's a class on this at Heritage if you wanted. It's a whole, whole quarter. But so basically, it starts with the Constitution. Its treaties are in the Constitution, supreme law of the land. The treaty with the Yakama Nation is under the same authority as the treaty with Japan after World War II. And the Yakima's rights were always trying to be squashed on the reservation, off the reservation. So they had to learn to fight for their rights through the courts. It first started 1905, U.S. versus Williams. There was a bunch of court cases before that with some of the other tribes. And then basically, so the two big ones are U.S. v. Oregon and U.S. v. Washington. So basically, the federal government was suing the states for not upholding the trust responsibilities of the treaty. They were trying to block their access to traditional fishing grounds. They were trying to block their access for foraging. They tried to make unfair rules. There was the fish wars in the 70s. People went to jail. But overall, while there were many hardships, the Yakimas were very fortunate in a lot of this case law. That fair share, there's a conservation burden on the federal government, ESA compliance. It set up a lot of the mechanisms that we still use today as far as managing fish and funding for fish projects. It started the intertribal fish commissions, and the Yakimas are in with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, the first fish management plans. Most people have heard of maybe the Bolt decision, was Judge Bolt, which established the 50-50 split, although the Yakimas don't think that is even a very fair split, considering that at the time of the treaty, none of the pioneers in the Northwest were fishermen. They were all farmers. And other, refrain from degrading fish habitat, the responsibility to replace lost fish. I mean, this started in 1905, or at least our US v. Oregon, 68, Washington 70. It made it through. There was basically it didn't get resolved until 2018. And that was kind of the culverts case. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with that. It was kind of a subset of the US v. Washington, where the courts wanted to see, you know, like real proof of these damages, and so they found that the culverts were the linchpin for showing the actual harm, and it went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. That was they affirmed. They didn't actually make a decision on it, but they affirmed the Judge Martinez and upholding the culverts case. And so now the state of Washington is responsible for fixing all of the culverts, state culverts that are fish barriers and are blocking habitat for anadromous fish. Okay, so on to the more salmon stuff. So basically environmental degradation and the decline of salmon. So prior to Euro-American development, there are estimates, you know, 500 to 800,000 salmon would return just to the Yakima River Basin every year. You know, it was spread out between the different species, you know, more spring Chinook, summer fall Chinook, 80,000 steelhead, these are estimates, coho and sockeye. So that's a lot of fish, almost, you know, close to 1 million. The Yakima River Basin was one of the primary anadromous salmon production areas within the entire Columbia River Basin, probably only second to the Snake River. And the Yakima River Basin is the largest river basin completely within the state of Washington. And it only took about 50 years to mess it all up. So, you know, some of the early stuff was, you know, logging. When the pioneers came, you know, it was a resource extraction, agriculture, you know, economies. Logging was one of the first. Began in the mid 1880s. There were mills scattered throughout the basin, small mills, big mills. I'm working on a project in Nile Creek. You know, Nile Creek seems pretty small, but there were at least 3 different mills in Nile Creek. And obviously, if you're doing logging, requires roads. So building lots of roads to haul the logs. And you add a bunch of roads and you increase the kind of the efficiency of the watershed, and you don't want it to be efficient. Nature is not as efficient. Inefficiency is much better. It generally increases the water flow. So rivers move both water and sediment. So when you add more water, the streams are going to start moving more sediment, and so you start getting some stream degradation there. A lot of sedimentation on like salmon reds. It's pretty common. Actually, it's very common, almost more than not, for stream cleaning and straightening. You know, windy streams are kind of a problem if you're trying to move logs or do agriculture. And of course, you know, the clear cuts in the 70s and 80s, which led to, you know, fire suppression. So we have about, you know, 100 years or more of natural fire suppression, which has really changed the way our forests grow and function. And kind of, you know, the Yakima Cascade Lumber Company in Yakima in 1903, they did a lot of splash dam logging, especially up in the Teanaway, where, so this picture here is a splash dam up in the Teanaway. So they would, you know, cut all the trees, they'd build a dam, they'd wait till the spring flood to come, and then they would blow it up with dynamite and flood all the logs from the Teanaway all the way down to Yakima. This scoured the Teanaway down to bedrock. It actually eroded bedrock. It was very destructive. A lot of these smaller watersheds have lots of small gauge railroads where they would, you know, straighten the stream, move it to the side of the valley, get it out of the way, and along with some logging. Another big step, actually probably even before logging, was beaver eradication. So even before the treaty, you know, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and why Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to the Northwest. Furs, especially beavers, were worth more than gold. So during that time, it didn't take them long. They basically eradicated most of the beavers from Western North America where they were. Beavers are super important for the environment. They're nature's engineers. They're building dams, they're slowing down the water. Water infiltrates into the floodplains. It creates habitat for juvenile fish for rearing. There are programs all over the state. We have programs for either reintroducing beavers or relocating problem beavers, problems for landowners, so they don't get lethally trapped. We can't do that. There are restoration techniques where we mimic beaver dams. We drive poles into the stream beds and, we've tried and kind of create a mimic a beaver dam. Overfishing in Lower Columbia, they literally built fish wheels on the Columbia and scooped up as many salmon as they could. Peaked in the 1880s, 42 million pounds of salmon in 1 year. And estimates that the original salmon runs in the basin had been reduced by 90% already by the year 1900. Irrigation. So I probably have too much detail here on irrigation, but irrigation is pretty important in the history and the evolution of the basin and what we have today, because it was important, right? This was a desert, and there were not a lot of settlers wanted to come here. They're like, oh, well, it's a desert. What are we going to do there? But we got a lot of water. So they figured out if you put water on this super rich volcanic soil, it grows very well. A lot of food can be produced here. So people as early mid 1800s were diverting water for agriculture. Basically, irrigation does like everything bad for salmon habitat that you could possibly do. Dewatering the channel, even spawning, rearing, migration, degrading water quality, elevating water temperatures, sedimentation, blocking spawning and rearing areas, loss of streamside or riparian vegetation. And the important part is that none of these were screened. So, and if you're diverting almost all of the stream, all those fish are going out into the fields. They were probably like, hey, free fertilizer. And I've read accounts where when they turned off the irrigation at the end of the growing season, they would go out and scoop up all the salmon, baby salmon, or whatever they could find in the ditches and salt it and eat it during the winter. So basically from the 1860s to 1905, irrigation was basically unregulated. People were just doing whatever. It was already over appropriated. The stream ran dry. The Yakima River ran dry. The US government came in 1905 with the Yakama project and really kind of took it over. They weren't concerned with fish at all. They were concerned with water and storage of water and irrigating as many acres of land as they could. They tried to put some screens on some of these. Most of them were not very successful or not maintained. They tried like electric screens for a number of years for some reason, but none of them really worked. And then during this time is when so storage, we're running out of water. We got to figure out how to store some more water. So they build all the reservoirs, Acachees, Catchless, Clallam, Bumping, and Rimrock, which as soon as they put up the reservoirs, the next season, the sockeye were gone. They came, where's my lake? There's no lake. They can't survive without a lake. They didn't know what to do. So they were basically extirpated from the basin, which means extinct, but only in a specific geographic area. And the reservoirs blocked, tons of habitat above the dam. And so by 1920, the estimates were, from 800,000, they were down to about 11,000 by 1920. And so they kind of progressed through time. They got better about it. Rosa was kind of the next in the Yakima project. They actually tried to put in fish passage on this one. They weren't very successful. Partially functioning fish ladder. It basically didn't work in the winter when the water was down or it was iced. So steelhead were not able to use it. It was not functional for steelhead at all. And they had plans to put a barrier to keep the fish out of the turbines, but they didn't actually ever build it. So between 1939 and this didn't get fixed until 1987. So there was next to no steelhead access until 1987, and fish were getting sucked through the turbines until then too. And then the Kennewick was kind of the last one. There's still no consideration for in-stream flow for fish. When they turned off the dams, they turned them off. So basically, and they were down to about 19,000 or 2% by the 1950s to 1970s. Sometime during the 70s, not really sure, but summer Chinook and coho also became extinct or extirpated from the Yakima River Basin. They basically, they would go out annually for, red counts, and they kind of just couldn't find them anymore, and they stopped counting. So by 1980, we were down to about 2,000 spawning salmon. So 800,000 down to 2,000 by 1980. Probably more information you guys need, but this is when the things started to change. Some people think the 80s were kind of funky in certain ways, but some good things at least happened for fish, beginning in kind of late 70s, early 80s. So Quackenbush was one of those things that the Yakama Nation had taken to the courts. And he said, yeah, Bureau of Reclamation, you can't, you're violating the treaty rights. You can't just turn off the water. Because when they turned off the water, they dewatered the stream, and all the salmon reds that were there all got dewatered, and they all died. And it kind of started with and then, the Northwest Power Act. This is mitigation for the Columbia River dams. That's the Bonneville Power Administration. That's where most of our funding comes from, protecting and mitigating and enhancing. And this when they started really thinking about the passage and screening. Then there's the ecology aquavella. This is the adjudication of all the water rights in the Yakima River Basin. Like who really owns this water? And so that started in 1977. They didn't actually, I don't think they resolved that until 2018. I thought I had the date in here, I'm not seeing it. But that's another one that took, 20, 30 years. But that did establish the time immemorial water right for the Yakama Nation for the maintenance of the fish that was promised them that would be there for them to harvest. And then this kind of started the Yakima River Basin Water Enhancement Program. This is through the Bureau, when the Bureau finally got going with screening and updating all these dams and passage. Phase 1 was also screens and ladders. Phase 2 is water conservation, and that's what started the discussions of fish passage at Cleellum. And then we're actually in phase 3. It's called the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. That's a whole other presentation, but it's a wider variety of storage and water efficiencies and habitat, both upland and aquatic and floodplain habitat. So basically, we're all getting along mostly together now. Nobody got along for a good 150 years, but we're working pretty well together now. And at least with the Cleellum Dam, I didn't put much in here about that. We're still working on that. I think right now they're building the juvenile facility to get the juveniles out of the lake. It's just because it's a reservoir, so the surface goes up and down, so it's kind of hard to design something where they can get out when they want to. They still haven't quite figured out the adults getting in. They're still put into trucks and driven. So I'm not sure how that's going to fall out as getting adults in there. Hydropower is another huge impact on the basin. Just even on the Columbia, there's 13 total dams between on the main stem Columbia. There's a ton of, there are hydroelectric dams on the Yakima. And so Yakima River salmon have to navigate the 4 dams on the Columbia, both juveniles going out to the ocean and adults trying to come back for spawning, and 4 dams on the Columbia, and then the gauntlet of the Yakima River. So just kind of generally other environmental degradation, overall development, the Oregon Trail, the Natchez Pass and Snoqualmie Pass, as far as pioneers coming to the Northwest. Kind of talked about irrigation and agriculture, but it's a big loss of our native vegetation. Transportation, trains. The first train came to Yakima in 1884. The building of I-82 and I-90. All those ponds along the freeway are not natural ponds. Those are all gravel pits that the DOT dug as they were going along to build the highway. They're all super shallow and super hot and full of predators and piscivorous non-native fish. And then, just general urban development, building a city next to a river. I guess, they need water, right? But then they start building flood control and levees and more stream cleaning and more straightening and tons more of invasive species. So there was a study done, was commissioned by the Bureau, Dr. Jack Stanford out of the University of Montana Flathead Biological Station with Central Washington University. It's called the REACHES study. So they came in, basically, I think the Bureau wanted to know, can we really bring salmon back? Is it worth spending all this money? Can it happen? And yes, it can. So going back to these, these large alluvial valleys, starting with the Easton Reach, Kittitas, Natchez, Sela, Union Gap, and the Wapato. So these were, before development, these were these huge pearls on a string, and that's Dr. Stanford came up with that term. So, you have migration reaches and then these giant pearls with vast floodplains and side channels and spring brooks. And when it was hot in the summer, there were cold places to go. When it was cold in the winter, there were warm places to go. These were basically giant salmon factories. Well, capable of producing 800,000 salmon, spawning salmon a year. So the study, part of the central part was looking at the reduction of the Holocene floodplain. So going back to that kind of the geologic time thing. So Holocene's about the last 10, 20,000 years. So here's a map of the Yakima floodplain. So the gray is the Holocene floodplain. That was the historic floodplain. I mean, there are some terraces in there that between 20,000 years, 10,000 years, but in general, that's the floodplain of the Yakima River. And then they kind of went through time as to how the floodplain basically got chopped up. Dikes, railroads, highways, agriculture. So basically on the right here, this narrow gray strip surrounded by all the pink is what's left of the Yakima River floodplain. And so at least, so down on the lower, the downstream end of this there's a lot of good floodplain there. And so another important thing about these pearls on a string is there's losing and gaining reaches. So when the river comes into one of these valleys, a lot of the water falls down into the alluvial gravels underneath the water. And then, the geology pushes the water back up when you get to the downstream end of these valleys. So a lot of the biologic productivity was found in the lower reaches of these floodplains. The Wapato was probably the largest. I mean, it was huge. The valley there is huge. It's in concert with, the Toppenish and the Toppenish fan. Huge. And they mapped so basically the Yakima River was all the way to the west, and over the last 20,000 years or so, basically has swung from one end of the valley to the other. Okay, so just kind of results, basically, habitat degradation. So when you go from 800,000 fish to 2,000 fish, there's a huge loss of these marine-derived nutrients. So when salmon spend most of their time out in the ocean, so it's nitrogen and phosphorus, and they're gathering all these marine-derived nutrients that would come when they came back, and that's part of their life cycle of when they die, is to basically fertilize the environment for their progeny. So when you lose that, the ecosystem as itself is short on those marine-derived nutrients. We're working on upgrading our getting those marine derived nutrients back into the system. We're going to start using a lot of the more of the hatchery fish, but it's kind of a process. You got to basically bake them to make sure they don't have any viruses, and you put them back out in the headwaters. Structural stream suffocation, the lack of woody debris, stream cleaning, lack of floodplain function, lack of floodplain area, huge reduction in pool habitat is really important. Just overall reduction in rearing and migration habitat, loss of cover, lower oxygen, less food. Wild fish need wild rivers. When you have a not so wild river, you have less wild fish. The impacts to water quality, both chemical, organic, and temperature. There's a lot of the legacy impacts from pesticides and herbicides, chemical-wise. There's still a lot of the streams. I think Cowiche Creek is one of them that's still on the 303D list for the ecology for fecal chloroform. Temperature is still a huge issue, especially in the lower river. I mean, we're still losing a huge amount of our juveniles trying to get out of the Yakima to get to the ocean. A lot of them don't make it through the lower Yakima even. Water quantity, I talked about the irrigation and a loss of basically volume, the volume that we're not going to get back because there's water rights. And with that quantity, so they basically turned the Yakima River Basin hydrograph, which is how it flows through a year, upside down. Generally, it should be high in the spring, early summer, and then tapers off, and then maybe some bumps in the winter. They've turned that upside down. It's high, during the growing season for agriculture when they release the water. So that's going to confuse a lot of creatures that live in the water. And then the flip-flop, so that was one of the fixes, because there's the upper Yakima, and then there's the Natchez arm. So to not dewater the reds, they came up with this flip-flop that they do every September. They kind of slowly turn off the upper Yakima and slowly turn on the Natchez. This is my way really quick. And salmon decline, expiration. And then finally, we had the ESA listing of bull trout in 1998, and mid-Columbia steelhead in 2006. So we need blocked habitat, water efficiency, and then invasive species, both plant and animal, and predators. So my apologies, some of this data is a little out of date, but it so looking at the 80s when things were really kind of bad, and then they've gotten better. Still, things are still really up and down. A lot of it has to do with ocean conditions. We've had the blob out in the Pacific Ocean is really detrimental to the salmon and their survival and making it back. This is also comparing hatchery origin versus natural origin. So that's what the HO and the NO stands for. Just kind of showing the coho, basically, extirpated, no coho, more coho, less coho, fall chinook, kind of a similar up and down pattern. And then just kind of visualize what this looks like. So, levees and roads and closing off floodplains, and you get the stream gets channelized, it lowers the water table, it turns into a fire hose, basically. Not good for any sort of aquatic organisms. I couldn't go without talking about at least climate change a little bit, because that's something we're dealing with and we're going to have to deal with. And part of our projects are trying to, when I get to them, my apologies, trying to mitigate for our climate change. We're not supposed to get less water. We're supposed to get less snow, more rain, but the snowpack is, that's vital. We have to have the snowpack to maintain the flows during the summer. That's where the salmon came from. That's what produced the hydrograph that triggers them when to spawn and when to outmigrate. So this is gonna be a problem. Just general global average temperature increases since the 1860s. If you're interested, there's Yakama Nation has a climate adaptation plan and how they see climate change and how it affects their tradition and culture, and how we're going to go about mitigating for this. Okay, so how do we fix this? Now we're getting to the good stuff. Sorry, you've been waiting all night. You're like, I thought it was about salmon habitat restoration. Okay, I'm getting to it. So how do we do this? Chaos. Nature is chaos. Those giant floodplains were chaos. The species thrive off of the chaos, complexity. So we got to figure out how to restart at least some level of chaos. And it's landscape restoration. It's not just what's in a stream channel. It's shrub step restoration and protection, forest health and resiliency. 100 years of fire exclusion. We need to do logging and thinning and restore the forests, especially the dry ponderosa forests where they excluded fire. We have all sorts of other species in there that shouldn't be there, that would have gotten cleared out by fire. Actually, they're finding that this forest thinning prolongs the snowpack. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a bunch of trees, it doesn't keep the snow on the ground. The trees intercept it. The trees, they're organisms. Open spaces within the forest actually prolong the snowpack. Reducing headwaters, or roads in our headwaters, reducing that efficiency. Of course, culverts and aquatic organism passage. A DNR recently put out, there's this 20-year forest health plan. If you're interested in forest health and how that plan is gonna get implemented, I recommend you check it out. All right, so Yakama Nation salmon recovery, mission statement: preserve, protect, enhance, and restore culturally important fish populations throughout the zone of influence of the Yakama Nation, and protect the right of the Yakama Nation members to utilize these resources as reserved for them in the treaty. So Yakama Nation fishery started in 1983, kind of when there was some momentum that there might be a change in how the basin was managed, using science with traditional knowledge and innovative projects. There's a ton of people, I don't even know all of them. Basically from the Methow all the way down to the Columbia, protecting those species we talked about, to honor, protect, and restore Nichiwana, I think I know how to pronounce that one, as tributaries and resources for the benefit of current and future generations through the treaty. So we have lots of supplementation facilities. The first one was in Prosser. So there's some of them are hatcheries, some of them are supplementation. Often in the beginning, they would catch salmon from other watersheds like coho. The upper Wenatchee still has coho, so they would basically catch them, put them in a water truck, drive them out to a stream, put them in the creek, kind of rack them up, force them to spawn. There's the Cleolum hatchery in '96. It's a research facility. The upper Yakima is the experiment. The Natchez is the control. We just finished the Samson Coho hatchery up by Ellensburg. Marion Drain's been an important hatchery for a long time. I couldn't find a date on that one. Fall Chinook, sturgeon, lamprey. I was actually crafted last week, and you can get Yakama Nation sturgeon there, and it's delicious. And then the sockeye reintroduction in Lake Cleolum in 2009. They still got to truck them up. Juveniles can get out. So basically over 100 years, there were no sockeye. We have our partners down in the Klickitat. They've got some hatcheries too. So, what is salmon habitat? I would say it's everything. I mean, it's the top of the Goat Rocks, right? Because that's where the water comes from. The watershed kind of defines the extent of salmon habitat. Everything's interrelated. Excuse me. That nature and restarting some sort of chaos, cold, clear, complex habitat. I described those floodplains in the Yakima, giant floodplains, side channels, spring brooks. This is kind of a cartoon here of kind of how that works with the hyperrheic and phreatic and the losing and gaining reaches. And there's the bugs, the macroinvertebrates that live down the hyperrheic. Like the Stanford study, they still found them like 3 kilometers away in like a farmer's field. They could drill down into the floodplain, and those critters are still living in the groundwater, spawning rear migration. And I always think of this, or I try to explain this as a sponge. And so the sponge was wet, and then we dried it out. And so we need to figure out how to rehydrate this sponge. So our streams have experienced a shifting baseline over through time, kind of basically everything I just described. Where are the pools? So a lot of people would look at this stream and go, yeah, it looks like a pretty good stream. I mean, it's got lots of vegetation. No, it's not. That's not good. This is what majority of our streams look like. One of my coworkers with Fish and Wildlife came up with this great description of it. Basically, it's a house of only hallways. So, you know, humans need complex habitat, right? We got a kitchen to go eat. We got a bedroom to go sleep. We got a living room to kind of chill out and rest. Well, fish need the same thing. They need a complex habitat, and the simplicity of this picture does not provide that. This is the chaos. This is the Teanaway circa 1900. I found if you can walk right up to a stream, there's generally something wrong with it. If you can walk up and down it with no problems, there's generally something wrong with it. It's lacking that chaos and the wildness and wild fish needing wild rivers. So we kind of, I mean, at least in the Yakima, they were doing some small habitat restoration stuff. It was mostly concentrated on bringing some of the numbers back and then realizing, well, we need to do more, bigger stuff with our habitat. So kind of around 2009, started in Tainum Creek, literally with a WCC crew and chainsaws and grip hoists, and inch by inch, dragging logs into the trees, into the stream. Kind of phase two, let's get some equipment out there. We can get some more logs in there. Let's get some with root balls on them. Getting more trees into the stream. And it just so happened in 2011, after we put like 2,000 logs into Tainum Creek, we had a ginormous flood. Some estimates were that it was a 500-year flood, or 1 in 500 chance of happening every year. They were familiar with the 100-year flood, 1 in 100 chance. A boomer, a big one, which was awesome. It was totally awesome. It was the chaos we were looking for. So here's the before, and then here's the after. I mean, there's some of the existing woods under there somewhere. You can see, the tree, there's that cottonwood. I'm sorry, I'm pointing, you can't see what I'm pointing at. Cottonwood here, same cottonwood, a lot of natural recruitment, and the stream just went wild. So that Tainum Creek is another that had the small scale railroad logging. So they basically straightened the stream and pushed it out of the way. So it was a single channel, didn't have any side channels, didn't have any wood, didn't have any complexity. We had this big boom river flood, and we gained approximately 2 miles of new side channels. The main channel flopped to a whole new channel. It was beautiful. So this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Tainum Creek. So this is kind of at the tailing end of the flood. This floodplain was full of kochia and other invasive weeds. It was dry as a bone. It was not functioning at all. Floods came in, rehydrated the sponge. This is kind of an aerial photo here. This is kind of what it looks like now. So rehydrated the sponge. So this is kind of, this that same dry floodplain. So this is when we were doing the project. Notice the snag. We didn't do any planting. Nature did it for us. The weeds didn't like being wet, but the native vegetation did, and it went wild. Okay, moving on to another project. We've been doing a lot of work in the Teanaway. There's the Teanaway Community Forest, the first community forest in the state of Washington. Kind of our timeline here, we kind of started in 2017, and we plan on working out there till 2023, working in all 3 arms of the Teanaway. So this kind of was our 2019. We haven't put together a 2020 update, but we'll work on that. So basically more lodge wood. This has some engineering components to it. So I talked about the Teanaway. This is where they did the splash dam logging. So it really just ripped the Teanaway up. In a lot of places, it's down to bedrock. The bedrock was eroded. So we've with some engineering, we're putting in these wood trapping structures because some people are concerned with the wood getting up and floating down to mitigate for the risk analysis in the Teanaway. kind of a typical of what, one of our plans, where we're planning to put different kinds of structures and in relation to the stream. So different kinds of structures. There's splitters. So if you want to split the flow, put flow down a side channel that isn't necessarily functioning and adding more water to it, getting it to start functioning again. Deflectors on banks to deflect water into a floodplain area, or maybe also a side channel. Here's some kind of the construction. So we, in the upper left-hand corner is one of the wood trapping structures. And then this is the loose wood that we put in between it to function as it is, or if it does wash downstream. Generally, Mother Nature does a better job of organizing the wood than we do. Engineers don't believe me when I say that, but I keep telling them that anyways. Helicopters we've been using lately too. We've used some in the Teanaway, where you can move a lot of wood in a short amount of time. That's my coworker, Ryan. So, almost 3,500 pounds in 25 hours of work. They're kind of expensive, but you get a lot of work done in a short amount of time. So some of the preliminary results that we're seeing out in the Teanaway, so this is kind of after, and we're getting some high water flow here. We find beavers sometimes will start using our wood within hours or days. They come out the next day and they've already started building off of the structures, adding more complexity, beaver activity. And this is important, especially in the Teanaway. So the wood functions to trap and store the sediment, especially in the Teanaway. It's a lot of boulders. All the small stuff gets washed away. So we need to start trapping the sediment to build that degraded channel back up so that it starts using its floodplain and rehydrating that sponge. It's more deposition. Okay, on to another project. This is in the South Fork Cowiche, just upstream from Snow Mountain Ranch on WDFW property. We do a lot of work with Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group, lots and lots of work. There are one of our greatest partners, along with State Fish and Wildlife, as a very willing landowner for us to do these projects. I'm sure you know where Cowiche Creek is, but so all these projects, we're sourcing the wood locally, if not adjacent to the stream or in the slopes above the stream or within the same watershed in that kind of order of priority, but at least combining it with upland forest health thinning and restoration. So we're thinning the uplands and we're restoring the aquatics. Chainsaws, lots of times. Every little bit counts. So this is that reach of Cowiche Creek. This was agricultural land, the same thing. They pushed the stream to the south to get it out of the way so they could grow stuff. So it's purchased in the 70s. Again, looking at the air photos historically, that's what it's used for. And again, this degraded channel, I see this everywhere. When you have more water, the stream just eats into its sediment. And when you take out all the structure, it doesn't store any sediment, so it all just washes downstream. And it's kind of that typical channel, the incised channel. So we're trying to go back to a more typical channel. This is another wood replenishment, loose wood in Cowiche Creek, a combination of logs and root balls. This was actually salvage wood from the Sadis fire. So we're using wood from on reservation. Some of our typicals of kind of how we like to put wood into streams. There's kind of an art to it too, in a sense, when you're looking at a stream and seeing how the water's flowing and how structure in the stream and the direction of flow is going to affect that flow of the water. So here's before, there's some after. There's kind of that aerial looking at that same spot. So another before, after, and then in 2017, so notice the same trees. So the wood is already working. Water is getting out of the channel. It's getting out on the floodplain. It's rehydrating that sponge and it's depositing sediment. Oh geez, we're over time, sorry. Looking at this effectiveness monitoring, and we're still kind of crunching this data, but, putting in groundwater wells to see how the groundwater in the floodplains is reacting to these projects. Sorry, I'll try and hurry up here. I'm over time. We just did a second phase this year, adding roughness to the floodplain, posts and logs on the floodplain, and 6,000 native plants. This was the kind of the big fun one we did in 2018. This is when we started using helicopters. Aggressive degradation requires aggressive restoration. This was a big project, 7 different sites, 5,000 logs, all of these permits. We call it the Fiesta. Rebecca Wassel from Mid-Columbia came up with a Fiesta, and I was like, well, let's hope it doesn't turn into a fiasco, but unfortunately did not. Source wood, like talked about before, all upland thinning, forest health, aquatic restoration, lots of partners, trying to get the word out. We didn't want people freaking out seeing logs flying through the air. Keep calm, game day. This was a lot of fun. We got to fly in helicopters. I've never flown in a helicopter before. It was pretty cool. And just great working with WCC and the Columbia Helicopters crew. And you lay out these flags and they would drop the logs, and they were pretty, it could somewhat arrange them for you. And it's fast. They work really, really fast. Got a lot of word out there. We actually had a tribal committee out to observe before, after. Lots of funding support, lots of partners. All right. Sorry, I went over time. That is it. Thank you.